For the basics of working with color in OpenToonz, I'm going to talk about three main sections. First, this section will introduce how to add color in the first place. Next, we'll take a closer look at the settings for the fill tool, and finally, we'll do a section on troubleshooting. I should also note, these demos will be for using color in Toonz vector levels. There's more on that back in part 9 if you haven't seen it. I've heard some people insist on using raster levels for color, but I'm a big fan of vectors for their flexibility to keep editing lines after color has been applied. So let's jump in and add some color. I've opened this demo file from a previous tutorial, and what we're going to work with today is the level palette here at the bottom of the interface, and then the style editor right next to it. If you don't see this content in your level palette and style editor, make sure that you have a current level active. For example, here in the X sheet, if I click on a blank cell, that means I have no current level and no content in my level palette or style editor. But if I click on a cell that has a drawing in it, then that drawing's level becomes my current level, and then I can see the swatches and values for that level's styles. So, by default, we've got two swatches in each level that we make. They appear to be black and white. The white, color 0, is technically transparent, indicated by these checkers at the bottom of its swatch, and it's basically locked as a null style. Then the black, color 1, is automatically applied to our brushstrokes when we're drawing in the level. So here we can see that black in the lines of our chicken. Our first goal is going to be to create a new style, change its color, and then use that as a fill for this chicken. So to start with, creating a new style, you can click on this button. It looks kind of like a post-it note, and if you hover over it, it says New Style. If you take that approach, be careful that you don't click on the button right next to it, which would create a new page. Very similar icon, but it has a folder tab, and that is not what we want. If you want to avoid that confusion, you can also just right-click in the level palette and then choose New Style on that list. Either way, that should give us a new style called Color 2 by default, and as we create new styles, it's a good habit to name them to keep things organized. So I'm going to double-click where it says Color 2 here, and since this is intended as a fill color for the body, I'm going to call it Body Fill, and then hit Enter to save that. A little note on renaming, be sure to click directly on the text itself. If you double click slightly above or below, it opens up another panel of the style editor, which for us is redundant right now. So I'm going to close that down, and again, to rename, double click on the text itself. So by default, our new style comes in as a duplicate of whichever style we had selected previously. In this case, that means our body fill starts off as a duplicate of color 1. We can change that over here in the style editor. What we've got over here are sliders and values for HSV, A for alpha or transparency, and then RGB. I'm going to start with a medium brown for the body fill, and a quick way to achieve that is to give this style a fair amount of red, medium green, and then I'll dial back the saturation a bit to end up with this kind of tan color. Now that we've got this color, we're going to fill in the character with it, and for that we'll use the fill tool. It's over here in the toolbar with this paint bucket icon, or you can also just tap the hotkey F to switch over to the fill tool. For starters, I'm going to try clicking with our new style selected within an enclosed shape here, and that gives us a fill for that enclosed shape. Note that the shape really has to be enclosed. If I want to see what happens if that's not the case, if I tap E to switch to my eraser and break the line here so that our shape is no longer enclosed, then we lose our fill. Without an enclosed shape here, if I try to use the fill tool again, I'm not going to get a result. If you've got this kind of issue, you can fix it by using the control point editor. So here I'll use that to close this gap. In my case, that made the fill come back. I found that's not always consistent, but if it doesn't come back on its own, you should be able to use the fill tool again to just reapply it. Another thing to note, up here at the comb, notice that our main body fill applied throughout the comb as well. My eventual goal is to have the main body its own color and then to have the comb red instead, so I don't want this fill to apply throughout. Knee-jerk reaction might be to tap E to use the eraser again and try to erase that fill away, but that's not going to work here. So this brings us to another point. in Toonz vector levels, the eraser tool does not work on fill areas. The fill is just a designation basically saying that all the area within this enclosed shape should be filled with this style. So it's not something that we can erase pixel by pixel. In my case, that's also why the fill came back when I reestablished the enclosed shape here, because that designation for the fill was still in there. So if I want to not have the comb filled up here, instead of trying to erase that fill away, what I'm going to do is zoom in, tap C for my control point editor, and then I'm going to clean up my lines to make these two separate shapes here. And that doesn't get rid of the fill just yet, so if I want this to go back to not having a fill, since I can't erase that away, what I'll do instead is select color 0. Remember, that's locked as a null style, and then if I use the fill tool with that and fill in that enclosed shape with color 0, it basically wipes out the previous fill that we had applied. So now we're back to this not having a fill, and let's go ahead and create another style to use as our comb fill here. So again, I'm going to right-click in the style editor and say New Style. This time I'll double-click where it says Color 3 and call this the Comb Fill, and I'll want this to be red for the comb. So over here in the style editor, this time I've already got red as an option since we're starting from white. More on that in just a second. So if I increase my saturation here, then I can get red for the comb fill. So now that we've done that, we might hope that we can use this new style to fill in the comb. So with my fill tool selected, I'm going to try clicking within the comb, but I'm not getting any result there. So it looks like nothing's happening. Actually what's happening is this style is being used to fill in this area, but remember, when we create a new style, it duplicates the previously selected style, and when I created the comb fill style here, I had color 0 selected. Remember, that's transparent, indicated by these checkers. So our comb fill style also came in as transparent since it's a duplication of color 0. So to fix that, over here in the style editor, I'll want to change the A value for alpha. 0 means it's totally transparent, and I'll want to crank that up to be totally opaque here. And once we have opacity for that style, we can see now it showing up in the comb. All right. So I'm going to do this one more time for the beak. This time I'm going to have comb fill selected when I create a new style, and that means we don't have to worry about the transparency. I'm going to double click on color 4 and call this beak fill, and then I'm just going to change the hue here to be orange, and we'll go with that as our beak fill. Then again with our fill tool, we'll click in the beak, and since that's already an enclosed shape, we're good to go there. And now we've got our character fully colored in this first drawing. A little thing to note, if we make any changes to these styles after already applying them as fills, then we can see those changes take effect on the character. So let's say maybe I want my body fill to be slightly darker, maybe a little bit less green than we've currently got on the chicken. For that, I can select body fill, I can take the value down a little bit, and I can increase the red, and as I'm making these changes to the style, those changes again are going to show up anywhere I've got that style applied in the drawing. On that note, maybe for a little bit more contrast between the beak and the body fill, I'm going to try darkening down that body fill. I'll stop now. I could go on, but I mainly wanted to show that kind of tweaking is possible with the OpenToonz coloring system. So now I'm going to speed up the footage while I clean up the lines for my other two drawings, and then I'll apply those fills, and we end up with color throughout our simple animation loop. All right, last thing to note, this palette applies to all the drawings in the same level, so that ability to edit our colors I was showing earlier will apply to all of these drawings as well. So if I were to take the body fill, and let's just try drastically changing the hue for our chicken here, and then hit L to see the animation again. Again, that change applies all throughout the animation. Now that I've done that, I kind of like the purple, so let's go with that. Now, let's say we want to get a little fancy and add some cell shading. First, I'm going to create a new style to serve as a shadow color for the chicken's main body here. And remember, when we create a new style, it starts as a duplicate of our previous selected style. So I'm going to make sure that I've got body fill selected as my current style, and then I'm going to make a new style based on that. Again, it comes in as a duplicate, and I'm going to rename this as body shadow. Then, in the style editor, I'm going to darken this shadow color down a bit. I'll start by taking the value slider and decreasing that for a darker value. This is effectively like if you were working with paint, mixing a color with black to make it darker. And if you're familiar with color theory, you know we'll have more visual interest if we don't just stop at that. So, I'm also going to bump up the saturation a bit and bump up the blue a little to make the shadow color a bit cooler. I think I might also darken it down just a bit more so we have more contrast for what I'm about to show. Ultimately, I'll probably lighten it back up, but for now we'll want that increased contrast. So once we've got our shadow color created, now for application, I'm going to tap B for the brush tool, and then I'm going to draw in a dividing line to delineate between the shadow area and the main fill area. Note when I draw in this line, I do want it to intersect with my outlines. I don't want it to be too far in, which would mean we don't have enclosed spaces for the main fill and shadow areas. Also don't want it to be too far out, because then it would look messy if it's going beyond our outlines here. So I'm going to make sure that the endpoints for my dividing line here are intersecting with the outlines. If we check the other end, looks like there's a little bit of cleanup to do there too. So now we've got the line placed where we want, but note we've also got this issue where it's overlapping with the outline a little bit and kind of appears to be eating into the outline's brushstroke. Luckily, we can fix that. The way that OpenToonz handles brushstrokes in vector levels, it treats each stroke as its own individual asset. And the most recent stroke is kind of layered at the top of the stack of those assets, so that's why we've got our dividing line showing up on top of our outlines here. We can move this stroke to the back of the stack by selecting it and then using the hotkey Control starting bracket to move it to the back of the strokes. And if you're curious, it doesn't have to stay that way. You can also use the hotkey Control ending bracket to put it back on top. But if we want to move it to the back of the stack, again, that Control starting bracket hotkey will achieve that. And now we've still got our dividing line in place, and it's nestled underneath our outlines instead of overlapping on top. So now I'm going to switch back to my fill tool and apply the shadow fill in its area, and now we've got cell shading on our first drawing here. To make it a little bit more subtle, I'm going to bump up our value just a bit, and then if I repeat that same process for the other drawings, then ultimately we'll have this cell shading throughout our simple loop here. You might notice some wonkiness where some areas might lose their fills as you draw lines over them. To be honest, I don't have an explanation for why this behavior can vary so much, especially in these different takes with the same drawing here. For this demo, I wanted to start by showing a flat fill first, and then add shadows from there. Technically though, the best practice would be to draw your shadows dividing lines first, and then apply fills. If you do lose a fill along the way, generally you can just reapply it. But if you find the fill tool not working, stay tuned for settings and troubleshooting. Alright, as a final touch, let's try adding some color to the lines. This is totally optional, but for some aesthetics it can be an effective choice, so let's go over how to do it. First, since we've got this medium purple as our main fill color, let's try making all the lines a dark purple to go with that. So I'm going to select color 1, and then over in the style editor, to make this purple, I'll give it a little bit of red and a little bit of blue. Now you can see anywhere that color 1 is applied, and that should be all of our brush strokes by default, we now have a subtle purple color. Also note, since we made this change to color 1, which is the default brush color, if we switch to our brush tool and draw some new strokes, they'll automatically come in with that purple hue. Okay, so we'll wipe those out. And next up, let's say we want to keep the body lines purple, but for the comb up here, let's make these outlines dark red. So we'll zoom in a little closer, and we'll want the red for these lines to be like a darker version of the red fill here. So I'll select comb fill before creating my new style, and that means the new style comes in as a duplicate of that red. Let's go ahead and name this comb lines, and then to make this darker over in the style editor, I'm going to bring its value down, and then I'll crank the saturation way up. Okay, now there are a couple ways to apply this new style to these existing lines. What I'm going to show here is I'll tap S to switch to my select tool, and then I'll click on this brush stroke to select it, and then with the stroke selected, if I click on my comb line style, that'll automatically apply it to my selected brush strokes. Now that we've done that, it'll look a little bit neater if we don't have this overlap, so with this brush stroke selected, I'll hit that Control starting bracket shortcut. That moves it to the back of the stack, and we're no longer seeing that overlap. All right, I should also note that with this new style selected, if I switch back to the brush tool and draw with that, we can draw new strokes with this color as well. And really, we could do new brush strokes with any of our styles available. Color 1 is the default brushstroke color, but it's not the only possible brushstroke color. That said, be aware, if I click away from this level and then click back on it, and now draw a brushstroke again, the new brushstroke defaults back to color 1 no matter what I had selected a moment ago. So with that in mind, I recommend thinking of color 1 as your main color for lines, and then you can make other line styles as needed. So let's wipe these out. And now, if we pull back and look at our other two drawings, note that the purple color has been applied throughout since my changes to color 1 in this palette affect everything in this level, sharing this palette. I'm going to quickly apply the comb style and then move those strokes to the back. And once that's done, we've got colorful lines throughout the entire loop. So now we've got the basic tools to get started with color. You might have noticed with the fill tool there were a bunch of settings and options at the top of the screen. We're going to take a closer look at those, and that's coming up next. I hope you find these videos helpful, and if so, subscribe for more tutorials and check out thundercluck.com, especially if you have any young readers or fans of animation in your life. Thanks for watching.